When I first stepped into the ballroom, no one looked up. It was one of those mornings that already smelled like summer. Cut grass, over-chlorinated fountains, and perfume hanging in the air like it had something to prove. I walked in holding the thin ivory card I'd received not at home, but at the field office. No embossed name, just a vague, Marlowe household, guest. Tucked into a plain envelope with the return address printed in Times New Roman. Even the way it had arrived felt accidental. I stood for a moment at the lobby threshold, watching the people mingle, laugh, clink glasses. It had only been 10 seconds, maybe 12, before the event assistant walked over and asked, "Catering team check-in is over there, ma'am." I looked at her, polite, composed, and nodded without correcting her. She blushed the moment our eyes met, mumbled something about mistaken identity, and walked away faster than she'd approached. Across the room, my parents were already in full host mode. My father, Indira Marlowe, had his arm around my brother's shoulder, gesturing grandly at something with his other hand. My mother, Vera, floated from table to table like a debutante at a gala she'd planned herself. I adjusted my plain black dress and started walking, my heels almost noiseless against the marble floor. The reception was already noisy, champagne corks, silverware clinks, and bursts of laughter, mostly centered around one person, Narina. To be fair, he looked the part. Navy blue suit, flawless posture, that charming head tilt he'd practiced since high school when he realized it made women laugh. A large banner stretched above the center stage. "Congratulations, Regional Vice President Narina Marlowe." It was his day. That's what Mom had said over the phone. I'd called her to ask if there was a dress code, and she'd paused before saying, "Don't overthink it, honey. Just show up if you want. It's Daniel's day." Daniel, not Narina. I'd forgotten they'd always used his middle name when they wanted to sound formal. To strangers. To strangers like me. I slid into a seat near the back, nowhere near the main tables, which were already full anyway. From here, I had a perfect view of the celebration unfolding without me. My father raised his glass and laughed heartily. "This boy," he boomed. "He's climbed every rung, from intern to the youngest regional vice president this firm's ever seen." A few executives in suits nodded approvingly. "And this family knows the value of hard work," he continued. "Daniel's always been the one who chased goals with discipline and drive. You know what I mean?" One of them chuckled. "And your daughter?" My stomach tightened. I hadn't been introduced. They hadn't even gestured in my direction. Dad waved a hand casually. "Avon? She works in security. Some government thing. We don't really ask much." The man let out a low laugh. "Government security. Sounds vague." Dad leaned in and lowered his voice just enough for the joke to land. "Not like Daniel. He tells us everything." Another chuckle. A clink of crystal. My cheeks didn't flush. I didn't look away. I simply watched them. Watched the way my father reduced my life's work into something that sounded like I guarded mall entrances. Security. That's what I'd been reduced to. I thought about Bogota, Berlin, Detroit. I thought about the 27 operations I'd led, the months spent embedded, the briefings I'd delivered behind closed doors at Capitol Hill. Security? I lifted my glass of water to my lips, letting it sit there long enough to cool the anger rising behind my teeth. Across the room, Mom caught my eye for half a second, then looked away before offering another hostess smile to the nearest guest. I remembered her voice on the phone last Thanksgiving. "You never needed recognition, sweetheart. You always knew your worth, right?" "Right." I turned back toward the stage. The slideshow had started, and Narina's face filled the screen. Photos of his first day in elementary school, high school football trophies, college graduation, office parties. I watched it like a guest at a stranger's wedding. The table beside mine erupted in laughter at a photo of him in a fake mustache from some Halloween years back. I wasn't in the photo. I wasn't in any of them. The room dimmed as the spotlight hit the stage. Dad raised his glass again and shouted, "To success!" "To success," they echoed. And I sat there, invisible in plain sight. The thing about silence is, it never protects you. It just delays the explosion. The thing about silence is, it never protects you. It just delays the explosion. That thought stayed with me as I made my way deeper into the ballroom. I kept to the edges, weaving between clusters of people sipping mimosas and pretending they weren't glancing sideways at each other's clothes. I walked past gold-foiled menus and name cards, careful not to catch anyone's eye. My heels didn't click. They whispered, and I was glad for it. A hotel assistant in a sleek black blazer intercepted me before I could reach the main table. She wore a practiced smile, the kind that suggested she'd already had one too many awkward run-ins this morning. "Hi, sorry. Your name wasn't on the main seating chart," she said, glancing at the iPad in her hand, "but your family noted you'd know where to sit." I nodded. Of course they did. She pointed toward the far left corner of the room, beside the emergency exit, not far from the security post where two guards stood exchanging casual jokes. There was a small table with a sign that read, "Reserved, event staff." It wasn't a mistake. I walked toward it and sat down without hesitation. The linen was wrinkled, the silverware mismatched. No centerpiece, no menu, no place card. Just an empty water glass and a chair angled conveniently so I could see the side of the stage, but not the stage itself. "I've sat in silence before," I whispered to myself, "but never at a table that confirmed exactly where I stand." I let the moment settle, let it carve itself into memory. A server approached cautiously. "Would you like coffee, ma'am?" "Yes, black. Thank you." He hesitated before placing the cup down. "You're not one of the vendors?" "No," I said flatly. "I'm family." His eyes widened just enough for the truth to sting. "Sorry, just your table." I nodded once, sharply. "I know." He retreated quickly, as though my words had teeth. I glanced back at the main tables. My parents were seated up front with Narina between them, as if staged for a campaign ad. My mother tossed her head back in laughter as someone whispered in her ear. Dad raised his glass to the CEO with that big, boisterous laugh he used when he wanted everyone in the room to know he was still in charge. I stirred my coffee. The slideshow began without warning. The lights dimmed slightly, and all conversation hushed into a low buzz. A screen dropped from the ceiling, and soft piano music swelled from the speakers. Narina's face filled the screen, first as a baby, then as a gap-toothed 7-year-old in a baseball cap too big for his head. The audience chuckled. Then came the high school graduation, his prom photos, his first suit. Pictures of office Christmas parties, award ceremonies, business trips to cities I'd never been invited to visit. I counted 37 photos before I realized what was missing. Me. There wasn't a single picture of us together. Not even one from when we were kids, and after 17, I might as well have vanished. The woman at the table next to mine leaned in and whispered to her friend, "I didn't know they had a daughter." "I thought he was an only child," the other replied, just loud enough for it to sting. I kept my eyes on the screen, but my grip on the coffee cup tightened. My reflection wobbled in the dark liquid. It looked like someone else. Someone smaller. The last slide lingered. Narina on stage at a conference, backlit, triumphant, with the words Regional VP, Central Division, stamped in bold beneath his name. Applause erupted. I didn't move, I didn't clap. Instead, I let my gaze drift across the room and found my mother's eyes just long enough for her to flinch. She looked away quickly, returning her attention to the applause like it was a life raft. And in that quiet space where I should have felt pain, I felt something else rise, a calm clarity that surprised me. Not rage. Not sorrow, just recognition. When people erase you long enough, I thought, you start doing it yourself. I had spent years making excuses for them, believing it was forgetfulness, or that I didn't belong in photos because I wasn't available, because I was overseas, or in briefing rooms, or trailing someone through a back alley in Caracas. But that wasn't true. I'd sent pictures. I'd invited them. I had been present in every way they didn't want me to be. They weren't protecting me from their world. They were protecting their version of the world, from me. I looked back at the slideshow's blank screen, still glowing faintly. This was not a family that forgot. This was a family that chose to omit. I didn't cry. I just smiled. Because sometimes, tears give them exactly what they want. I didn't cry. I just smiled. Because sometimes, tears give them exactly what they want. I stayed in my chair a little longer than necessary, even after the slideshow ended and the applause died down. I watched people begin to move toward the buffet, the chatter picking up again, now centered around Narina's college roommate who'd just flown in from Dallas. I had no appetite. Instead, I reached into my purse and retrieved a folded piece of cardstock, a program from a ceremony in D.C. 7 years ago. It was creased at the edges and worn from years of being moved from bag to bag, drawer to drawer. At the top, in gold lettering, were the words, Federal Commendation Ceremony, U.S. Justice Department. My name, bold and centered below. I remembered the day clearly. My team had completed a 3-year-long international investigation, and I'd been selected to receive the highest award given to a field operative outside of wartime. I'd invited both of them. I could still hear Dad's voice on the phone. You know Daniel's golf finals are that weekend, right? He's been training for this. It's the state tournament. You understand, don't you? I had paused too long, and he'd filled the silence with, You know we're proud of you, kiddo. I'm sure someone will film it. Maybe send us the link. Mom hadn't even followed up. No call, no card, not even a reply when I texted her afterward that I'd won. Nothing but an automated scene under my message. I tucked the program back in my purse and let my gaze drift toward the windows lining the back wall. The sun was blinding, almost aggressive, casting long lines of gold across the white tablecloths. It made everything look sharper than it needed to be. I wasn't surprised by any of it anymore. What stung wasn't the pattern, it was the realization that it had never been accidental. I reached for my phone and pulled up an old photo. Me in fatigues, standing at the gate of a military prep school. I'd taken it the day I got my acceptance letter. I was 18. My eyes looked hungry in a way they no longer did. That same week, Dad found the acceptance letter in the mail before I did. He'd folded it back into the envelope and slid it onto the kitchen counter like it was junk mail. That's not for girls, he'd said, as if the matter was already closed. No man wants to marry someone who outranks him. Trust me. I did not trust him. I applied in secret to a federal law enforcement training program in another state, forged my mother's signature on the forms, and never looked back. Until moments like this, until days like today, when my family sat under a chandelier that cost more than my first car and toasted to a man they hadn't seen wrestle with his morality in alleyways at 3:00 a.m., hadn't seen break down after failed ops or carry a child from a raid site while helicopters thundered overhead. And yet I was the one being erased. It wasn't protection, it was projection. Their version of success had always been Narina, clean-cut, marketable, boastworthy. I was the liability, the messy truth, the reminder that pride doesn't always wear a suit. I let my eyes land on my mother. She was mid-laugh, her mouth wide in a practiced curve. Then, for a brief second, her eyes flicked toward me. Her smile faltered, not a lot, just enough to register. She blinked quickly and turned away, laughter softening to a social hum. They knew. They always had. They weren't confused or forgetful. They had edited me out the same way you crop a photo, carefully, surgically, so the remaining image still looks complete. There comes a time when understanding their reasons doesn't heal you anymore, I thought. It just delays your healing. It was that moment, the quiet, unspectacular moment sitting beside a fake ficus near the fire exit, when I stopped rationalizing it all. No more, they meant well. No more, they just didn't know how to show it. No more lies dressed up as love. A nearby table laughed again. Someone mentioned Narina's recent interview with a business journal. I heard the words, future CEO and natural leader thrown around like confetti. I reached for my glass of water and held it steady in my hand. That day, I stopped asking why they forgot me. I started asking what they were so afraid I'd become. That day, I stopped asking why they forgot me. I started asking what they were so afraid I'd become. I stayed out of sight for a while after the slideshow, hovering near the hallway, where the servers moved in and out with trays of carved salmon and champagne flutes. There was something comforting about being in a space where no one expected me to speak, where I didn't have to dodge questions or smile politely at people pretending not to recognize me. I pulled out my phone, mostly for something to do, checking work emails I wouldn't answer, and messages from colleagues who didn't know where I was today. Or why. It was easier to read unread praise from people who respected me than listen to passive erasure from the ones who were supposed to love me. That's when I felt her presence. I didn't look up, didn't need to. The scent of her perfume hit first. Floral, expensive, a signature she'd never changed. Vera always believed consistency was elegance. "Sweetheart," she whispered, her tone light, performative, "maybe tuck the badge inside your jacket. It's not that kind of crowd." There it was. No greeting. No, "You look beautiful." No, "We're glad you came." Just a directive. Just another adjustment request to make me easier to stomach. I slowly turned toward her and studied her face. She wore that same soft smile she'd used for years, part motherly concern, part social manipulation. It was the kind of smile people used when asking for small favors that felt like compliance but were actually control. "I'm not ashamed of what I do," I said quietly. "Of course not, darling," she replied, too quickly. "It's just, some of the guests are conservative. You know how some of the older men can be." "You mean men like Dad?" Her smile flickered. "He just doesn't like talking politics at family events." "This isn't politics." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply stated a fact. I had no intention of removing the badge, and she knew it. Her eyes dropped to my chest where the badge was clipped neatly inside the lapel of my blazer. "I just think," she said, her voice thinning, "it draws attention." My fingers rested against the cool metal badge. I could have made a scene, could have asked her how many other guests had been asked to make themselves smaller. But I didn't. Instead, I smiled. "It's funny," I said. "You've spent so long trying to make sure no one asks what I do, and now you're worried they might actually want to know." She blinked once, lips parting as if to say something, then decided better. "Well, just think about it," she said, already turning to leave. "You know how proud we are of you." I watched her walk away, back into the crowd, back into the performance. Proud. What a strange word. So often used to cover up what people couldn't control. If they were really proud, they wouldn't have hidden me from their lives like some inconvenient truth. I thought back to Thanksgiving 4 years ago, how every time I mentioned my work, Dad shifted the conversation. "That's not dinner talk," he'd said. "The less people know about your job, the better." When I called him out on it, he acted confused. "I'm just trying to keep things easy," he said. "Not everyone wants to hear about field work." A few months later, I overheard him on the phone with a colleague. "No, we don't talk much about her job. It's complicated." No, it wasn't complicated. It was simple. I worked hard. I saved lives. I did my job well. But that didn't fit the version of the family he wanted to show. They weren't protecting me. They were protecting their illusion. One where the daughter didn't outshine the son, where her career didn't raise too many questions, where their friends didn't have to rethink their assumptions. They'd drawn up a contract of silence, unstated, unwritten, but understood. And I'd signed it with my silence more times than I cared to admit. But not today. I returned to the ballroom, moving through the sea of tailored suits and practiced smiles, and took my seat again at the back table. I unclipped the badge from inside my jacket and pinned it to the outside, plain as day. It caught the light just right as I shifted in my seat, glinting in full view of anyone who cared to look. No one said anything, but a few noticed. That was enough. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to confront. I just needed to stop hiding. You can only hide someone for so long before the world comes looking for them. You can only hide someone for so long before the world comes looking for them. That thought stayed with me as I returned to the ballroom, the air colder now, like the air conditioning had been dialed up to match the tension. I passed a few guests on the way back to my seat. They nodded politely, some with uncertain smiles, some not bothering to hide their curiosity. Then I saw it, my nameplate, well, a nameplate, a glossy, printed card sitting neatly on my assigned table beside the bread basket and lukewarm salad. I stood over it for a moment, staring. Eliza Park, parking patrol, night shift. I blinked once, twice. No one flinched. No one corrected it. No one even looked my way. It wasn't just the wrong name, it was the wrong life. A quiet hum of chatter floated around me. Forks clinked. Someone popped a second bottle of champagne, and I stood there with my hand on the back of my chair, realizing that this wasn't an accident. This was an editorial choice. A not-so-subtle footnote to my existence. I sat down slowly, crossing my arms as I scanned the room. A few heads turned, then turned away. One woman at a nearby table smirked. A man whispered something to his wife and nodded toward me. I didn't move, didn't correct anyone. I let the falsehood stand in the air like perfume no one acknowledged but everyone smelled. The moment you stop defending lies about yourself is the moment the truth finds its voice. A small hand tugged on my sleeve. I looked down and saw a wide-eyed little girl, probably 6, smiling up at me with the confident awkwardness only children can get away with. "Are you the security lady?" she asked loudly. "Daddy said you're guarding the doors." The table behind me fell silent. I stared at her, blinked once, and smiled gently. "No, sweetheart, I'm not guarding the doors today." "Oh," she said, clearly confused. "But Daddy said you don't do the kind of work people clap for." My heart didn't break. It clenched, then hardened. "Sometimes," I replied softly, "the most important work is the kind that people are too scared to clap for." She tilted her head like that made sense, then ran off, her pink shoes flashing as she disappeared between white linens and polished shoes. I turned back to my untouched plate and picked up the fork, stabbing the lettuce without hunger. A few minutes later, I spotted Narina laughing with a group of colleagues near the bar. He was in his element, gesturing animatedly, holding court like a seasoned politician. I waited until one of them stepped away, then approached. He didn't notice me at first, until I was almost beside him. "Got a second?" I said quietly. He turned, his smile shrinking but staying on his face just enough to remain camera-ready. "Avon," he said. "You okay?" "I just wanted to let you know," I said calmly. "Whatever game you and Dad are playing, I see the rules now. I just never agreed to them." His eyes narrowed slightly. "What are you talking about? Eliza Park, parking patrol? The kid asking if I'm working security? Come on, Narina, it's not that subtle." He sighed and glanced around, lowering his voice. "Look, this is a celebration. Can you not make this about you?" I tilted my head. Not everything is about me, but erasing someone always is. He paused, hesitating like he was considering whether to lean in or walk away. "You know how Dad is," he finally said, shrugging. "He doesn't mean anything by it. He just handles things the way he knows how." "No," I said, straightening. "He handles things the way he wants to. You just follow the script." He scoffed. "It's not a script." I gave him a look. "Then stop delivering it like one." His smile disappeared, replaced by a cold neutrality that reminded me we weren't siblings today. We were politicians on opposing platforms. I turned and walked away before he could say another word. Back at my table, I sat in silence and watched the family play their parts like it was a rehearsed play. Lines memorized, roles locked in. I was never written into this script, only allowed to walk through the set and pretend I was crew. Not anymore. They didn't just rewrite my story, they published it without asking. That's the last chapter they'll write for me. They didn't just rewrite my story, they published it without asking. That's the last chapter they'll write for me. The moment I decided that, everything shifted. I wasn't suddenly brave or filled with some poetic clarity. No, I was just done. The kind of done where your skin gets still, your voice sharpens, and you start choosing your silence instead of swallowing theirs. It didn't take long before my next test came, and of course, it came from Daniel. I was standing near the drinks table, halfway through my second sparkling water, when I overheard him speaking to a group of sharply dressed men from his firm. The tone in his voice had that confident hum, like he was dropping a detail he wanted to sound modest, but land heavy. "You know, my sister's with the DEA," he said. Yeah, she helped us secure that Houston event last year, got us clearance and a clean sweep, real smooth. My mouth went dry. He said it like I was a backstage pass. A convenient connection. Not a federal agent who'd spent 2 years building a confidential network to dismantle trafficking routes along the Gulf. Not once did he say my name. I waited until the group peeled off, one by one, called by buffet lines and polite escapes. Then I walked over. He was already turning toward the bar when he saw me, and his smile flickered. Avon. Next time you use my badge to polish your reputation, I said quietly. At least spell my name right. He blinked. What are you? You told them I helped you in Houston. You didn't mention it was a federal sting, part of a multi-agency joint op. You made it sound like I handled venue permits. He chuckled, raising both hands like I was being overly sensitive. It was just networking. Relax. That's what family does. Support each other. Support? I tilted my head. Funny. I don't remember you at any of my briefings, or any court testimonies. Or sitting next to me while I typed 120 pages of a debrief in a bulletproof vest at 2:00 a.m. His smile flattened. Come on, Avon. Don't make this weird. No, I said, stepping closer, lowering my voice. You made it weird when you chose to wear my title like it was a name tag you borrowed for a night. Before he could respond, someone new stepped up behind me. Avon Marlowe? A voice said, surprised but certain. I turned and found myself looking at Mayless Kincaid, Daniel's ex from college, now a reporter for one of the major networks. Her dress was elegant, her heels higher than I'd dare, but her gaze was sharper than either. I thought that was you, she said. You led the cartel exposure case last year, right? DOJ briefing redacted your name, but I knew the initials. Daniel's face stiffened beside me. The people around us paused mid-sip, ears tilting our way. I smiled slowly. That was me. Well, damn, Mayless said, offering her hand. They said whoever cracked that case had done more in 2 years than most do in a decade. I guess they weren't exaggerating. Guess not. People started to whisper, names repeated, timelines remembered. Someone near the punch table muttered, Wait, that's her? I looked across the room at my father. He'd caught the exchange. His smile was gone, replaced by something colder, tighter, a narrowing of the eyes I recognized not as curiosity but calculation. He was trying to figure out how to spin it, how to make this moment fit the version of events he'd already sold. But this moment didn't belong to him. More guests approached, casual, curious, suddenly respectful. You were with Homeland for a while, right? Didn't you brief the Senate subcommittee last March? I heard you worked with ICE on a multi-border op last year. That true? I stopped brushing them off. I stopped minimizing. I answered plainly. Yes. I did. That's correct. We recovered 14 minors from a locked facility. Yes, that was me. And just like that, my silence stopped serving them. It started serving me. The tide was turning, not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable. You teach people how to treat you by what you allow, what you stop, and what you reinforce. They'd spent years making sure no one knew who I was, and now they couldn't shut me up even if they tried. They spent years making sure no one knew who I was, and now they couldn't shut me up even if they tried. It didn't take long before the shift in the room found its first real ripple. I was standing near the dessert station, half listening to 2 distant cousins argue over the cheesecake when I heard my father's voice lift above the usual hum. He was standing at one of the central tables, surrounded by his old golf buddies and a few colleagues from the insurance firm he'd retired from, holding up a glass like he was mid-toasting someone. Now that's a young man going places, he declared, motioning toward a lanky, eager-looking kid in a too-big navy suit. Just landed an internship with the FBI. We're proud of this generation's defenders. A few claps followed, some murmured affirmations. Someone said, We need more like him. I stood 10 feet away. I'd spent 24 years in federal operations, 6 of them overseas. I'd walked through cartel compounds in Colombia and sat at war rooms in D.C., and here I was, watching a man who once told me not to make a big deal about my job, sing the praises of an intern because he fit the narrative better. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I just whispered to myself, I've been deployed across continents. But sure, the intern in khakis is the hero tonight. He didn't even look my way. But someone else did. The whispers had started. People who used to look through me were now turning toward me, questions forming, curiosity building. And my mother, who'd been circling the room with a polished air of practiced grace, noticed too. She moved in like a shadow. Smooth, silent, always composed. "Can we talk for a moment?" she said through her smile, not waiting for my answer before steering me toward a hallway near the restrooms. Once out of earshot, her expression changed. "You're making people uncomfortable," she said, sharp but soft enough to sound maternal. "Put that badge away before this turns into something it shouldn't." I stared at her for a long beat. "Define shouldn't," she sighed. "This isn't the time or place." "Neither was your slideshow," I replied, "but that played just fine." Her eyes flicked around, making sure no one was watching. "Avon, you told the hotel to list me as staff. You stood by while your granddaughter called me the security lady. You let people whisper and laugh. And now that someone might actually listen when I speak, now it's an issue?" She stepped forward, voice lowering. "Why do you always have to make this about you?" That line. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I reached down, pinched the edge of my blazer, and unhooked the badge that had been clipped there all afternoon. I held it out between us like a mirror. "You don't get to erase me just because my truth is louder than your fiction." She didn't take it. Her hand flinched but stopped halfway. The crowd behind us was starting to quiet. Someone had noticed, then another. The ripple moved again, and I let it. For the first time in my life, I stood there and let the silence do something. For me, I clipped the badge back onto my jacket, and I walked back toward the center of the ballroom like I belonged there, because I did. They had tried everything to mute me, but now the volume wasn't in my voice. It was in the room that had finally gone silent. They had tried everything to mute me, but now the volume wasn't in my voice. It was in the room that had finally gone silent. It started with the sound of a fork slipping off a plate. Dad had just taken the mic for his toast, his signature moment at every family gathering. He cleared his throat, nodded toward Narina, and launched into his well-worn speech about legacy and ambition. I leaned back in my chair, fingers still brushing the edge of my badge, and waited for whatever performance he'd rehearsed this time. "I always say," he began, his voice round and steady, "you raise your children with hope. But when they become more than you ever imagined, that's pride." A few guests gave polite nods, the kind that say, "Hurry up," without saying it out loud. "Narina," he continued, lifting his glass, "has done everything right. College, career, commitment, the kind of son every father dreams of. Regional vice president at 35. What more could a man ask for?" Before the applause could begin, before his smile could settle into place, a bright ping from the wall-mounted TV to the left of the ballroom stole the attention of half the room. A loud voice cut through the murmur of dessert and speeches. "Breaking news from Washington this evening. Sources confirm that the DEA, in partnership with Homeland Security, has successfully taken down the largest international trafficking ring seen in over a decade." The room froze. My face appeared on the screen. Not the Avon they knew, or chose not to know, but the woman in tactical gear, headset on, eyes sharp. My official title scrolled beneath the image. Chief Tactical Director, South American Ops. People gasped. Phones came out. Forks paused mid-air. The anchor's voice continued, naming the operation, listing numbers, lives recovered, assets seized, indictments issued. And then the words that hit louder than the clinking glass that slipped from my father's hand, led by Director Avon Marlowe, who is expected to brief the Department of Justice early next week. His flute shattered against the marble floor. Silence wasn't silent anymore. I didn't flinch, didn't move. I didn't stand or wave or nod. I just sat and watched, the same way they had watched me for years without ever seeing me. The same way they had smiled through every gathering while shrinking my name into a whisper. Someone near the head table murmured, "She's with the DEA?" Another, louder, "She's on the DOJ's most awarded list this year. You can Google it." And then the ripple began. One guest near the front was already typing, "AVENMAR." He trailed off as the results populated. A moment later, he looked up from his phone, stunned. "She's her." Another woman leaned over and whispered, "Why didn't anyone say she was here tonight?" My father attempted to laugh. "Well, I guess that's our girl." But the tone wavered. It fell flat. Even he knew it, because it was too late. Words couldn't rewrite what was now public record. Recognition didn't belong to him anymore. They no longer controlled the room. My work did. I saw Narina's smile twitch, caught halfway between admiration and panic. He tried to look surprised, like he hadn't heard Melis call me by name earlier, like he hadn't stood beside me at the bar and minimized everything I'd spent my life building. My mother's expression, though, was the one that held. The edges of her mouth were tight, her eyes scanning the guests like she was bracing for an avalanche. And it came, not in noise, but in stillness, in the way people began turning toward me instead of away, in the way they stopped pretending I was invisible. I didn't stand, didn't chase the moment, I let it happen. Because this wasn't vindication, it was truth, finally allowed to breathe. No one needed to speak for me anymore. You either walk inside your story and own it, I thought, or you stand outside your story and hustle for your worthiness. I had stopped hustling, and just like that, the story they wrote for me burned away under the light of the truth they couldn't ignore. And just like that, the story they wrote for me burned away under the light of the truth they couldn't ignore. The silence that followed wasn't the same kind I'd grown used to all my life. This one was thick, humming with awareness, the kind that choked on its own discomfort. No one dared speak first. And then, crack. My father's hand shook just enough for the base of his champagne flute to slip from his grip and hit the marble floor. The glass didn't just shatter, it exploded, shards skipping across the tile like truth breaking into a room that had long kept it out. He didn't say a word, but his face paled. The veins at his temples pulsed. His jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might crack too. He looked at the screen as if it had betrayed him personally. "This bound wasn't supposed to happen like this," he muttered to no one in particular. He wasn't performing anymore. That moment, for once, wasn't about appearances. It was raw, unfiltered loss of control. And I watched it all with a strange mix of sorrow and release. Not because I enjoyed it, but because it finally matched the imbalance I'd carried quietly for decades. The crowd began to stir again, the hush fracturing into ripples of movement, conversation, and phone screens lighting up like fireflies. Then, clear, confident heels approached. I didn't have to turn around. I recognized her voice before she spoke. "I don't know how you were introduced tonight," said Cressida Harlow, holding a wine glass in one hand, her voice amplified by the silence. "But I know how I'd introduce you, as the woman who risked her life for mine." Every neck in the ballroom turned. Even Dad's eyes flicked upward like he wasn't sure he'd heard right. Cressida stepped forward. Senator, public figure, high profile, untouchable in the political circles this room worshipped. "I was in Santiago 3 years ago," she continued, walking toward me like she'd been waiting all night for this. "Targeted. Untracked. Everyone said it was too risky to extract me." She stopped just beside me and looked directly at my parents. "She didn't." My father tried to adjust his expression, but it twitched. Cressida turned to me, raised her glass, and said, "Thank you for not letting protocol cost me my life." And she clinked her glass lightly to mine. It wasn't a toast, it was a correction. The ballroom's oxygen shifted. People started to move toward me, slowly, like I was someone they were seeing for the first time. Some came just to shake my hand. Others mumbled apologies for not realizing, or "we never knew," or "you should have said something." I nodded, accepted the kindness without needing it, because it no longer felt like begging for scraps. Meanwhile, across the room, my parents stood like two people watching a dam break and realizing they'd built the wall themselves. They leaned into each other, whispering. My mother's lipstick was smudged. Dad's face had the stiffness of a man trying to calculate whether pride or apology was the more damaging option. I said nothing, because this wasn't revenge. This was the undoing of a carefully curated lie. I had been their shadow for so long, they never imagined the light would choose to hit me directly. But now that it had, there was no pulling me back into the dark. I thought about the years they spent crafting a version of our family for the world, a version that fit in glossy Christmas cards and shallow elevator conversations, a version where I was the cautionary tale behind every forced laugh, and now they were the ones shrinking behind their name tags. Someone from the press, probably a friend of Malus, asked for a quote. I smiled politely and said, "The work speaks for itself." Then I turned away, not rudely, just enough. Enough to say, you don't owe anyone the version of yourself they're comfortable with. And for the first time that night, I didn't feel like I was in their house. I felt like I had built one of my own. And for the first time that night, I didn't feel like I was in their house. I felt like I had built one of my own. The murmurs didn't fade. They spread, thick and alive. The kind of buzz that fills a courtroom before a verdict is read. I watched it crawl across the ballroom like smoke, curling around conversations, infecting glances, lighting curiosity like dry wood in a matchbox. I didn't move. Not at first. I sat at that ridiculous back table, alone under a cheap floral arrangement, while my name drifted from one end of the room to the other, not in whispers, in awe. Avon Marlowe? She's the one in that DOJ op. Did you see the footage? I always thought she was just, I don't know, quiet. And then I saw it, the microphone, still hot, still waiting. Someone had left it at the podium after Narina's overlong thank you speech. I stood up. I didn't walk fast. I didn't need to. The air parted like it was expecting me. Like maybe, deep down, it had always known this moment was coming. I climbed the steps and stood behind the mic. No one clapped. No one interrupted. They simply watched, breath caught in collective uncertainty. I looked around slowly, at faces that had smiled through my erasure, at relatives who only remembered me as the one who didn't finish college, at old neighbors who once asked if I was doing security at airports. Then I spoke. My name is Avon Marlowe. My voice didn't shake. I am a federal agent. For over 2 decades, I've worked with the DEA. I've led international operations, taken down 5 trafficking networks, and built teams that now train global agencies on tactical response and crisis infiltration. I paused. I wasn't reading. I wasn't performing. I've been asked not to talk about it, to keep it quiet, for their comfort, for their image. Because apparently, doing the work isn't as palatable as bragging about golf tournaments. I looked at my father then, and though he held his posture, his eyes were wild behind the practiced calm. I've been told, I continued, that people like us don't talk about politics at dinner, that I should keep my job, discreet, that there's no need to make others uncomfortable. I took a breath. But here's the truth. The work never needed their permission. The risk didn't pause so they could protect the dinner mood. And the truth doesn't stop being real because it's inconvenient. I stepped back, just slightly. Then I said, the next time someone in this family tells you what I do for a living, ask them why they never asked me directly. I didn't drop the mic. That's too dramatic for someone who builds power in stillness. I simply walked away. The applause didn't come immediately. It didn't need to. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of recognition. Full of weight. People didn't know whether to clap or apologize. Some did both. Some looked down at their drinks like shame might drown in champagne. Others nodded to me like they finally understood the terrain they'd been standing on all night. I didn't care. I had said what I came to say. Across the room, Vera was speaking quietly to an older couple, her hand nervously adjusting the brooch on her chest. We didn't want her to feel pressured by our attention, she said, loud enough for me to hear. I smiled to myself. A moment later, my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. A text from Collins, my supervisor. It was a screenshot of Twitter. A photo of me at the podium. Someone had taken it from across the room. The caption read, DEA Director gives silent masterclass in power and poise at private event. Family dynamics be damned. And below it, the internet is hers now. I didn't respond. Instead, I slipped the phone back in my pocket and let the room move around me, finally small, finally quiet. They wanted me small, quiet, forgettable. Instead, I became undeniable. For years, I carried their silence like a burden, but now I wear their discomfort like armor. For years, I carried their silence like a burden, but now I wear their discomfort like armor. The ballroom faded behind me as I walked out through the service corridor. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. It felt poetic, slipping out through the same exit they once assigned to me like I belonged to the staff. The difference now, I chose it. The night air outside bit at my cheeks, but I didn't flinch. The weight that had wrapped itself around my chest like a wet blanket for years was lighter, not gone, just no longer mine to carry. I drove straight to the house I grew up in. I hadn't planned to go there, but I'd left a jacket in the hallway earlier, tossed over the banister like a woman still trying to be invited in. It was a strange thing, wanting to retrieve a coat from a place that had stripped you of everything warmer. Inside, it was quiet. I didn't call out, didn't announce myself. Just walked toward the hallway closet where I'd last seen the jacket and opened the drawer beneath it to check for my gloves. That's when I saw it. A cream-colored envelope, perfectly sealed, bearing the gold-embossed emblem of the executive office. My name, my full name, typed neatly in the center. I recognized the insignia immediately. It was a formal invitation to the White House, dated 6 months ago. I opened it slowly, methodically, as if my hands already knew what they were about to confirm. Inside was a letter from the president's office, inviting me to a private leadership roundtable for senior federal directors. My breath didn't hitch. My stomach didn't drop. I just stood there. Of course she hadn't told me. Of course she'd tucked it in a drawer instead of handing it to me with pride. I stared at the paper in my hands and thought, they weren't just afraid of who I was becoming. They were afraid people would notice. I folded the invitation, slid it into my wallet, and closed the drawer softly. No drama, no storming, no confrontation, just the quiet finality of a chapter ending on its own terms. I left the house without looking back. Driving home, I didn't turn on the radio. The silence wasn't heavy this time. It was calm, a buffer between the person I was and the woman I'd stepped into. At a red light, I thought about what it meant to detach, not in anger, but in clarity. I didn't need to be there anymore. I didn't need their apology. I just needed to walk away knowing I hadn't disappeared. I'd just grown too large to fit the space they left for me. When I reached my condo, I parked, grabbed my bag, and walked inside without taking off my shoes. There was a notepad still sitting on the kitchen counter, half a sentence scribbled on it from 2 days ago. I ripped the page off and started over. Visibility is not a gift, I wrote. It's a declaration. I stared at the words, then underlined the last two twice. This keynote for the Women in Leadership Summit next month wasn't about stats or strategy anymore. It was about legacy. Not the one they tried to write for me, but the one I chose to build. I poured a glass of water, sat on the couch, and started outlining the speech. It flowed faster than I expected. Not because I was inspired, because I was free. I stopped chasing acknowledgement and started building legacy. And if they wanted to whisper about me now, they could. Let them whisper. I'm not walking back through any door that made me smaller to enter. Let them whisper. I'm not walking back through any door that made me smaller to enter. The sky was still dark when I pulled away from my childhood street. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't need to. Some places don't deserve a goodbye. They deserve an exit. I didn't even get 2 blocks before my phone buzzed. I ignored it at first, assuming it was a coworker or one of the guests from the night still trying to process what had happened. But when the voicemail notification popped up on my dash, the name on the screen made me blink. Director Collins. I pulled into an empty parking lot near a closed florist shop and listened. Avon, it's late, so I'll make this quick. CNN wants you on primetime, full segment, no agency talking points, no filters. They don't want the DEA, they want you. Think about it. You earned this moment. I ended the message and stared out into the still, sleepy quiet of early morning Des Moines. I didn't feel nervous. I wasn't even surprised, just ready. This time, I wouldn't let anyone else speak for me. This time, the story would start with my name. Back home, I kicked off my shoes, took off my jacket, and placed the White House envelope on my desk next to the invitation for the Leadership Summit. The contrast was stark, one hidden, one celebrated, but both had my name on them. The next day, I stopped by a local print shop. I handed them a screenshot. One someone had texted me the night before. The TV still of me standing at the mic, the CNN banner below reading, Avon Marlowe, DEA Strategic Commander, the woman who redefined leadership. Can you frame this? I asked the guy at the counter. He looked at the image, then back at me. You want a plaque or a border? Just clean. Simple, no need to dress it up. When it was ready, I didn't hesitate. I mailed it. First class, signature required. No note, no return address. Just the image. The truth. It was the only version of me that ever mattered. That night, I stood at the podium of a hotel ballroom in Chicago, now as the keynote speaker. The event was buzzing, lights soft and warm, but the atmosphere entirely different. These weren't people looking to size me up. These were women looking for themselves in someone like me. I opened my speech with the same line I had scribbled on a post-it just a week ago. Visibility is not a gift, it's a declaration. The room went quiet, not out of politeness, but attention. I spoke without notes, without hesitation, about power, about omission, about how silence is rarely about peace and almost always about control, about being boxed, about choosing dignity over approval. Near the end, I paused. You don't need to be seen by the people who taught you to stay invisible. You just need to see yourself clearly. And without apology. The applause rose like a wave and didn't stop. Later, backstage, as I was collecting my things, a young woman approached me. She couldn't have been more than 25, her name tag half hidden beneath a cardigan sleeve. You told my story, she said, voice soft, eyes wet, and gave it an ending I didn't think possible. I smiled, not politely, not performatively, but wholly, because I knew. I didn't win because they changed. I won because I finally did.